Well, joining us to discuss the movers and shakers in the global markets is Kyle Burgess, who's a portfolio manager at Nedbank Private Wealth. Kyle, thanks so much for your time.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Great. So we're seeing the rand slightly firmer right now. Not to delve too much into the politics, but do you think that possibly this Supreme Court ruling could have had a bearing on the currency?
So I think it definitely is a positive development. That being said, going into December, I think this just puts a lot more pressure on President Jacob Zuma and, of course, the electoral conference in December. So certainly a lot of eyes on that. But I think we'll really have to see how it plays out and really how the story develops.
And I must say, I'm very startled by the moves that the rand has made this week. I mean, you one day out of the office and you come back the next day, completely different picture. We started the week at 1380. We're now below this 1340 handle. I mean, emerging markets have rallied really strongly against the dollar this week. Question is, I mean, is there a tie, perhaps some U.S. inflation data due later on this afternoon that could potentially be the break to this rally that we're seeing in the EM space right now?
So it's certainly an important data set that's coming out this afternoon, but really it stems from the Fed releasing minutes on Wednesday.
Right.
And what it showed is that essentially there's quite a lot of confusion around when to increase rates. So I think generally we probably will see a December increase. However, the problem is that we've got really sort of stubborn inflation in the US, and there's a bit of confusion as to why that inflation is actually there at the moment. So there's a lot of, like any good economic theory, I guess, there's not really consensus on it. But one sort of interesting line of thinking is that what we have seen is in the tech space, so guys like Amazon just really depressing the prices and bringing the prices of goods and services lower. So just as an example, so sporting goods are at the moment sort of 6 to 8% cheaper in the US than they were 2 years ago, which is a direct result of players like Amazon.
Right.
So that being said, on the other hand, you've also got this concern that now we've seen sort of 8-9 years of recovery. There's been really low interest rates. If you don't increase interest rates enough, there's not going to be enough sort of ammo for the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve, if we do start seeing a downturn, because we are getting to the recovery is getting a bit long in the tooth. So it's a fine sort of balance. But anyways, the most important thing is that inflation is at the forefront of this. If you look at inflation in general, it's at 1.9%, but the Fed really preferred to look at PCE excluding food and energy. And currently that's below 1.5%. So, certainly a lot of eyes on that data coming out this afternoon, and a plethora of other data out of the US. So certainly something to move markets. And, being Friday the 13th, we're hoping for some sort of positive moves out of the US that can, bump us back into positive territory here locally.
Yeah, hoping for a better Friday the 13th than one that the president is surely having following that High Court ruling. But we did see some company activity today. So Stadio getting into a bit of a tie-up with Brimstone to potentially acquire a new education asset. How do you make that deal?
So they've been an incredibly busy company for the last sort of month or so. So essentially, Stadio is the tertiary education business that was unbundled out of Curro. So for investors, what they would have seen is that if they were holding 100 Curros, they would have got 100 Stadio shares. At that point, Curro was probably trading at about sort of between 38 and about 35 rand. It was unbundled. Stadio is trading sort of at about 6 rand a share. What we have seen, as soon as they sort of listed, they then started raising cash. So there was a rights issue. The last day to trade for that, unfortunately, was on the 10th. So those rights are going to be taken up at 2.50. So effectively raising about 400 million, which is, as far as I understand it, probably about 20-25% of their market cap. They then today announced the acquisition of Mill Park.
Right.
So this acquisition will be done through an SPV where they own 70% of it, and Brimstone essentially own the other 30% of it. So really interesting transaction, and the guys at Stadio and PSG certainly have been incredibly busy over the last sort of couple of months.
Yeah, no, they haven't definitely not taken a break. But I suppose you could understand the tie-up with Brimstone. I mean, they bring to the fore very strong empowerment credentials there for Stadio.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't really gone into the deal as far as the tie-up is. I mean, the news only came out this morning, but it's certainly something to, an interesting development anyway. Right,
and I was actually just looking out to see if there's been a major reaction in Stadio's share price. It looks like it is down, but only marginally down 1.2% at this stage.
Well, I mean, from the listing we've seen, because there's quite a short sort of space of time for guys to get involved in the actual share, so they could take up so it'd be eligible to take up these rights at 2 year-end 50, we saw quite a lot of volume going through, albeit, maybe retail sort of volume, but essentially the share price up 15-20% sort of, and there was days that it was back-to-back that. So, certainly a lot of activity in that share at the moment.
So there's a view that perhaps your Advtech should possibly also consider unbundling its tertiary assets and listing it. Perhaps it could also get the same warm welcome that investors have given Stadio. What do you make of that?
So I think they've certainly got some really lovely brands to, if you have a look at the likes of Varsity College, Rosebank College, the School of Design, which, so they really do have some nice brands. As a percentage of market cap, I'm not quite sure how big that would be. Right. Because, I mean, if you look at Stadio, for instance, that's about very close to 3 billion rand market cap, and Curro at the moment is trading just under 16 billion. So it's a significant sort of business to unbundle. I'm not sure what the what the Advtech sort of split would look like, but certainly I'm sure they'll be watching this very closely and sort of definitely taking notes. So yeah, we'll be really watching that. Yeah,
and then Kyle, just to finish off, taking it back to activities in the US, I understand at the weekend Janet Yellen is due to give an economic policy speech. Should we be watching that very closely? Perhaps it will dictate how we'll open the trading week next week.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be a lot of central bankers from this afternoon giving speeches, and I think it'll just give a lot more color to the US economy. There's been a lot of developments this year. They are trimming back their balance sheet, going into the end of the year. As we mentioned earlier, inflation is very important, so I certainly think investors should be watching that. There's going to be definitely some pearls of wisdom to take, as there always is, to take out of it.
Most definitely. But Kyle, enjoy your weekend and have a much better Friday the 13th than the president.
Thanks, I'm sure.
That was Kyle Burgess, who is a portfolio manager at Nedbank Private Wealth.